In lesson 9.3, we learn about two very special right triangles. One of them is the isosceles right triangle, also known as the 45-45-90 triangle, in which two legs are equal, and the hypotenuse is the leg length times the square root of 2. And there are two rules for this. One rule is that if you want to go from the leg to the hypotenuse, you would multiply by the square root of 2. An example down below helps you to see that right here. And that rule is in writing here. The second rule is that if you want to go from the hypotenuse to the leg, you would divide by the square root of 2. And that rule is here. And you can see it evidenced down below, going from the hypotenuse to the leg. This occurs, again, in an isosceles right triangle, meaning two legs are the same, or a 45-45-90 triangle. And so over here we were multiplying by the square root of 2 to go to the hypotenuse. Coming from the hypotenuse, we divide. Sometimes they try to make it a little more difficult and challenging for you to figure out. So what I want to show you is this is also true in the second example on the right-hand side. Going from the leg to the hypotenuse, it looks very strange because you see the square root disappear, but when you notice, when you multiply by the square root of 2, what's happening actually is you're taking that 4 square root of 2 and multiplying by the square root of 2, which then yields 4 times the square root of 4, which is the same as 4 times 2, which then gives you the 8. Also, if you were looking at going from the hypotenuse to the leg, and you know that you're dividing by the square root of 2, 8 divided by the square root of 2, we would have to do something called rationalizing. Rationalizing means you have to multiply the denominator and the numerator by the square root of 2. On the top, we would have 8 square root of 2. And down below, the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4, which we know is 2. And if you simplify it, what you happen to notice is that the 8 divided by the 2 turns out to be 4. Or in other words, you end up with 4 times the square root of 2. So the example on the left is the easier one to look at, but it also works for the one on the right. The big ideas are that when you're going from a leg to a hypotenuse, as you see highlighted in red on the top left, you multiply by the square root of 2. And when you go from the hypotenuse to the leg, you divide by the square root of 2. This again only occurs in the special right triangle that's a 45-45-90, otherwise called an isosceles right triangle. We do have one other kind of special right triangle. It's called a 30-60-90 right triangle. And this right triangle has 3 different side lengths because it has 3 different angles. I like to call them the short, medium, and long, or the short, medium, and hypotenuse, I guess. And I have a few rules that I like to use when we're doing these. The first rule that I like to talk about is what happens when you go from the short leg to the medium leg, here evidenced in red, so short to medium. When I'm going from short to medium, what occurs is I take that short leg and I multiply it by the square root of 3. And so you can see over here that what's happening is I'm multiplying by the square root of 3. X turns into x times the square root of 3. 5 turns into 5 times the square root of 3. Likewise, if I'm going to go from the short leg to the hypotenuse, meaning I'm going from the x to the 2x, I'm doubling something. And that's also written off to the side here in the blue highlight. So to go from the short leg to the hypotenuse, multiply by 2. Now the funny thing is the other 2 rules that I have is just going backwards, and those are dividing instead of multiplying. What I mean by that is to go from the medium leg to the short leg, what I see, medium to short, is I'm going to be dividing by the square root of 3. So here's the medium, I'm going to the short, I divide by the square root of 3. And you can see that on the left example down at the bottom as well. Going from the medium to the short, I divide by the square root of 3. And last but not least, if I want to go from the hypotenuse to the short leg, instead of multiplying by 2, I would be dividing by 2 instead. And you can see that 10 divided by 2 is 5. And so the examples down below show that. I'm not going to talk about the one that's on the right-hand side, but let's say that the same rules apply to that as well. Looks a little bit trickier, but kind of works like the one that we had previously with the square root of 2's. They disguise it, things simplify. Maybe give that a shot on your own and see if you can figure that out. Okay, so 4 rules. In red, going from short leg to medium leg, multiplied by square root of 3. In blue, going from short leg to hypotenuse, multiplied by 2. In brown, going from medium leg to short leg, divide by the square root of 3. And in orange, going from hypotenuse to the short leg, divide by 2. These are the 2 special right triangles, the 45-45-90 triangle and the 30-60-90 triangle. These triangles are extremely important and will come up again especially when you get to pre-calculus, but you'll probably also see them again in Algebra 2.